Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and just wanted to share with you some things that I've learned, things about Anti-Federalist philosophy, because as I was running for office and talking to people, you talk to people on the left about the Constitution and everything, and they think it's a conservative document. People on the right think it's a conservative document, and as I started to look more at it, I realized it's really more of a compromise document. They made a lot of compromises to get to that Constitution, and so it isn't exactly conservative, it isn't exactly liberal, but it was designed to bring the states together so that they could form a new nation. But as I began reading, the booklets that are passed out at tea parties and whatnot, they usually come with a copy of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And I realized, the Declaration of Independence is pretty extreme. It's talking about, free and independent states. It's talking about, separating from Great Britain. The Constitution seems a lot milder. Is this what came out of 1776? And the more I got to thinking about it, I remembered that thing they taught us in grade school about how there was something before the Constitution, these Articles of Confederation. But they were too weak, so we don't have to worry about that. Let's just skip on to the next chapter, which is usually what happens, and if your education was like mine, you didn't hear anything else about it. Just Articles of Confederation were too weak. So I went back and I read the Articles of Confederation. And after reading the Articles of Confederation, I'm like, they're very similar. Both the Constitution and the Articles of Confederation have articles. Okay, there's a different number. The current Constitution has 7. Articles of Confederation had 13. It's a lot more verbose, and there's no amendments. But I wondered, is it really a compromise document, or is it something more conservative? So that's something I began to dig deeper into, and I discovered the Anti-Federalists, a group of people who some of you will know the more famous of them, but I'll tell you a little bit more about the ones you may not know as well, because they were on the losing side of the debate, and because they were on the losing side, they've kind of been written out of history. So, in our nation today, we see the progressives constantly going out and redefining words. Some radio hosts call them word burners. They like to get rid of words they don't like. But we saw George Orwell teach us about what happens when someone gets in and messes with the language. In 1984, they created Newspeak, and Newspeak had its own dictionary. And they took out of the dictionary words they didn't want people to use. And one of the best examples is they didn't want people to use the word bad. They didn't want you to think bad thoughts. And so if you wanted to say something was bad, you had to say it was ungood. If something was really bad, you'd say it's double plus ungood. And by doing that, they take away your ability to criticize the government and say it's bad. Well, they don't just do that there, they do that with other things. If you've read 1984, the slogan, war is peace, slavery is freedom, ignorance is strength. Once you start to adopt that worldview, then everything becomes relative. Everything becomes what the state tells you those words mean. So, this has been going on not just since Orwell was talking about it, it's been going on for a long time. One of the words that is under debate right now is the word corporation. So I went back to the 1828 dictionary because it's a very old dictionary. It's not the oldest, but it's very complete. It's written by Noah Webster, I believe. Daniel Webster?
It's
Noah Webster.
Okay, sorry.
It's actually written from a Christian worldview. And so you get a very different take reading these definitions than you do reading just any other dictionary. And in 1828, the definition of a corporation was a body politic or corporate formed and authorized by law to act as a single person, a society having the capacity of transacting business as an individual. Then you can read the rest if you want the full definition, but notice the word person in there, in 1828. Now, we just had a Citizens United ruling where the question was, could a corporation create an ad, run it against Hillary Clinton to criticize her policies? Well, the left got all up in arms and said, no, you can't do that because corporations aren't people. They are currently pushing an amendment to the Constitution. A lot of people were talking about Article 5 Convention before. One thing to consider is Wolfpack and a lot of these other left-wing organizations, their flagship amendment is a 28th Amendment that will overturn the Citizens United decision to say corporations are not people. Well, if they could just look in the dictionary, they would see a body politic or corporate formed and authorized by law to act as a single person. It's a no-brainer if you simply read the words of the definition. Another word we're seeing the left try to redefine is marriage. In my state, we lost our battle. We fought very hard. And in your state, two federal judges, just got up and decided, hey, we're going to redefine marriage for not just the state of Virginia, but every state in the 4th District. And it's happening all over the country. We're seeing it happen in Utah, we're seeing it happen in Wisconsin, we're seeing it happen in 2008 in California. They've decided that marriage doesn't mean what we always thought it would mean. Marriage doesn't mean what it says in the Bible. Marriage doesn't mean what it said in the dictionary. Now, what did it say in 1828? The act of uniting a man and a woman for life, wedlock. The legal union of a man and a woman for life. Marriage is a contract, both civil and religious, by which the parties engage to live together in mutual affection and fidelity till death shall separate them. Marriage was instituted by God Himself for the purpose of preventing the promiscuous intercourse of the sexes, for promoting domestic felicity, and for securing the maintenance and education of children. I think that whole definition is important. In Maryland, we're going to have a convention next month. I'll be sitting on a panel, and one of the main topics they're going to be discussing is how should we define marriage? And I chimed in and I said, just look in the dictionary. It's already there. But if you're going to rewrite it to make a nice ad slogan or a bumper sticker or something, it's got to have God in there. It's got to have a union between a man and a woman united before God.
That's right.
Another thing that marriage confers, and it's included here, is that it confers legitimacy upon the children, and it talks about preventing the promiscuity of the sexes. It sanctifies that coital relation between man and woman. And a lot of people don't think about that when they try to say, well, let's create something other than marriage. Let's create civil unions or something like that. Well, you're saying that we want the state to call that kind of sex that people are having as legitimate. And only marriage can do that. So that's something we need to hold on to and not let the other side redefine for us. Move on to the next one. More definitions that are being changed. Gender. In Maryland, our governor just signed a law that's going to redefine gender. We also see it in New Jersey, we see it in California, and Houston, Texas. They just passed a law redefining gender. Gender, this is a modern dictionary, but 1828 isn't very different. Gender is the state of being male or female. Okay? Can't be both unless you're born with both. But the definition of gender is the distinction between the two. The word male is defined as an individual that produces the sperm. Okay? Female is the one that produces the egg. 1828 defines it a little more family friendly. They say the male produces offspring, the female conceives offspring. But the significance of gender, the significance of the word male and female is that distinction between the two. They have gone so far now as to say that if you are a man who feels like you want to be a woman today, and it can only just be today, it doesn't have to be every day, well, we're going to treat you like a woman. Okay, in Maryland, I can walk right into a woman's bathroom and say I feel like a woman, beard and all, okay? And nobody has any right to kick me out. Nobody has any right to question my gender identity. They've even passed laws, I think in New York, where they say, if you feel like you're the opposite gender that your genitalia show you, we can change your birth certificate to show that. So Joe can have his birth certificate changed to say he was born a female Joanne at birth. That's how absurd it's become. And again, we've got to put a stop to this, because once they start changing these word definitions, there's nothing they won't be able to change. Our most basic grasp of fundamental ideas of reality are being challenged by the left. Another word that we don't often think about that has had its meaning changed over time is the word state. Now, this is the 5th definition in the 1828 dictionary, but that's because I had to get past state of matter, state of being, things like that. So I'm not cheating by going ahead to the 5th definition. This is the first one that actually conveys what we think of in terms of a state. But a state is a political body or body politic, the whole body of a people united under one government, whatever may be the form of government. Okay? Talks about, below, the whole idea of, the commonwealths, the states of Greece. When I was in school, I wondered, we were learning about the city-state, and we were learning about the nation-state, and I said, well, when did things change between ancient Greece and Sparta and Rome to where a state was just a subdivision within a country? So let's go on to the next one. Now the word nation, a lot of people don't think of a state meaning a nation anymore, but that's what it used to mean. A body of people inhabiting the same country or united under the same sovereign government as the English nation, the French nation. Okay? If you read deeper into the meaning, it talks about the fact that a nation is a common people, usually from the same family heir, sharing the same language, same culture, things like that. Well, that was a state. When the American Republic was formed, the people saw Virginia as their country, as their state, as their nation. Marylanders saw Maryland as their country. If you know much about the war between the states, Robert E. Lee was asked to fight for the Union. But he says, I can't betray my country. This country being Virginia. So that is a meaning that has changed over time. And again, if we forget the meaning, then the word burners can come in and tell us what to think about. Federal government. Now when I was in school, I was taught that the word federal meant the top government, the supreme government, the boss. And a lot of people, and pardon me, I still haven't worked it out of my vocabulary. I said it earlier and I didn't mean to say it. I don't use the word federal when describing the government we have now. Because the government we have now is not a federal government. Federal means pertaining to a league or a contract derived from an agreement or covenant between parties, particularly between nations. Okay? Now this is 1828, so they had, they had some time to adapt the definition. So if you see down to definition number 3, they say friendly to the Constitution of the United States. Okay? But that just shows that this changing in word definitions was already in the works back then. But remember that federal means pertaining to a legal contract between nations. Okay? Now I have a question. When was the founding? Anyone want to take a stab at it? Who goes for 1774? Who goes for 1776?
When we declared our independence. Caveat.
Who goes for 1787? Okay. Who's got the caveat?
Right here.
Okay.
You got to forgive me. I taught American government. Okay. The nation was founded July 4th, 1776. The government of the United States was the 1787 Constitution, finally ratified in 89.
Okay. Let's go to the next one. So, I'm with those of you who say 1776. Because in 1776, that's when we signed the Declaration of Independence. Anybody know who these gentlemen are? The gentleman in the blue over here, John Hancock,
Good-looking guy.
President of the Congress, you know, signed his name in big handwriting so the king could see it and wouldn't mistake it. This gentleman over here is Charles Thompson. A lot of people think that the Constitution was signed on July 4th, 1776, because that's what it says at the top. But actually it wasn't. These gentlemen signed on July 2nd, and they were the only two to sign at that time. And then most of the people came in afterwards, and most of your signatures are added sometime around August 1st of 1776. But this is when we look at as, you know, the birthday of America, of the United States of America, because that's when we called ourselves the United States of America. Before then, we had a government of sorts. We had the Continental Congress. We had the Articles of Association, starting in 1774. Well, Lincoln went back to 1774. When he said he wanted to keep the Union together, he went back to the Articles of Association. But in the Articles of Association, they don't call themselves the United States of America. They call themselves British America. The Articles of Association were basically an agreement to boycott British goods. They were protesting the Stamp Act. They were protesting the Intolerable Acts. And they wanted to send a message by saying, let's not buy certain herbs, certain molasses, certain hats, certain gloves, you know, minor things in the grand scheme of things, but they were trying to interfere with the trade and put pressure on the British Parliament. Well, it obviously didn't work, because then Parliament came back with the Coercive Acts, and that led to all the events that followed, the American Revolution and so forth. So Lincoln wanted to say that was our government, and that was the founding of the United States. That was necessary to make his further argument that the Union created the states, and not the states created the Union. And if you take that away, then the whole idea of our republic changes. If the states created the Union, then who is the Union to tell states, you have to do this, you can't do that, you have to stay in, you can't leave, or what have you? Are states sovereign? And that's a question that I think each of us needs to consider, because it's one I've been wrestling with for quite some time. So August 1, 1776, Samuel Adams gives a speech, and he concludes his speech with these words: "If I have a wish dearer to my soul than that my ashes may be mingled with those of a Warren and a Montgomery, it is that these American states may never cease to be free and independent." You know Patrick Henry. These gentlemen were the radicals. These gentlemen were in control of Congress up to and through 1776. It is because of them that we were actually able to declare independence. The people on the other side, the James Wilsons, the moderates, or what one historian that I've been reading, a more conservative historian, calls conservatives. It's interesting that today we think of conservatives as people being for limited government and liberty. Well, back then, the conservatives were more people who wanted to conserve the old way.
Traditional.
Wanted to keep a more British-friendly government. And there were those, you know, the Tories wanted to remain loyal. The conservatives wanted a little autonomy, but the whole time they were saying, this isn't going to work out, we should not declare independence. Once they did declare independence, this isn't going to work out, we should make peace. You know, they were fighting gentlemen like Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry all the way. So you know Patrick Henry's famous speech, "It is in vain, sir, To extenuate the matter, gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war has actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. A lot of people take that line out. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. And it roused the people in the Congress to actually go and fight and aid their brethren in Massachusetts, which began the revolution. But it's important to understand that there was a contingent of people who were against that, who were saying, let us not go into that. We're told that there was unanimity in the Continental Congress to sign the Declaration of Independence, but there were actually people who dissented. We're not told about that. So I want to go into one more thing before we go there. The wording of the Declaration of Independence tells us what the people I consider to be the founders, what their intention was. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands that have connected them to another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station that the laws of nature and nature's God entitled them to, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they declare the causes which impel them to their separation. They're saying right there, we've had enough. We've tried every manner of remonstrance. We've tried to make amends. We've tried to, we've suffered evils while evils are sufferable. But now it's time for us to separate. And following that, the next line, see, I think that should be the most quoted line. But the next line is the most quoted of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Everybody knows all men are created equal. They are, okay, so these are the 5 truths. And understanding that there are 5 truths is important in how you look at it, because Jefferson, in laying out the Declaration, is laying out the rationale for new government. So all men are created equal. That means we're not subservient to a king. You're not over us just because you were born with a silver spoon in your mouth. That they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And that whenever any government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right, it is the duty of the people to alter or abolish this government and set up new guards that will ensure their future safety and happiness. I'm paraphrasing there, but I'm sure you all know this well, and if you need a cheat sheet, we've got copies of the Constitution and Declaration right here, free to take for anyone. But these 5 truths are the basis, are the rationale for what follows. And what follows is a list of 27 complaints. 27 complaints against the King of Great Britain. Now my theory is the Declaration started, just like the Articles of Confederation, as complaints against the Parliament. Most of these acts were done by Parliament. The King was sort of the go-ahead, and of course, you know, the King or Queen still has the power to veto any act of Congress, but Queen Elizabeth didn't veto same-sex marriage over there when she could have. But the founders needed to go against the sovereign authority. They needed to establish that not only were they breaking free of unjust lawmakers, they were breaking free of the British right to rule over them. And so this line of complaints concludes, at one point they actually refer to themselves, and that's what tells me they were actually talking about Parliament instead of himself. But they conclude by saying that a prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Now this statement exists, I believe, to counter the claims that a lot of people will say, well, you can't go against the government because of Romans 13. See, our founders were men of faith. People have argued, you know, they were deists, you know, they were atheists, they didn't believe in God. That's just not supported by the facts. And if you go to Wall Builders, David Barton has done a lot of research on this, and there are many other people who have done so as well. So these were men of faith, and they were saying that in the case of Romans 13, it says that you are submit yourselves to the higher powers because they are appointed over you for your good. But then it goes further and expresses how a king or a ruler who is doing his job will punish the wicked and reward the good. And he wasn't doing that. And so they're saying that Romans 13 does not constrain us in this case because this is a prince whose character is marked by every act which may define the tyrant. He's unfit to rule us. They go on then to conclude with their main purpose, which is to say, we, the representatives of the good people of the United States in Congress assembled, trusting to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do declare that these united colonies are of right and ought to be free and independent states. There's that language there, that free and independent states. That they are absolved from all connection with Great Britain, all connection with the state of Great Britain. The word state is used as if Britain is a nation. Well, that's what state meant back then. And that as free and independent states, we have the power to conduct war, conclude peace, contract alliances, engage in commerce, and do all other acts and things which free and independent states may of right do. This is the meat of the Declaration of Independence. And we know how it closes up our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. But we need to understand that they were declaring themselves free and independent states. Now, can anyone tell me where in the 1787 Constitution it says the states are free and independent? Good, because it doesn't. You see, and that's what I meant when I said there's something missing, something that got lost between 1776 and 1787. Because if we look in the Articles of Confederation, it's in there. So now I'm ready for this. So, another quiz. Who can tell me who the first president of the United States was?
Too easy.
I'll ask a question that, I don't know, maybe you guys can get it. Who was the first president in America? That's a different question. President of the United States, President of America. Henry Maria Wingfield was the president of the Jamestown colony. So if you really want to get someone with a trivia question, who was the first president in America? Henry Maria Wingfield. Okay? Well, when we're talking about the United States, well, you can't have a president of the United States when the republic is not called the United States. So the first president of Congress, Continental Congress, Peyton Randolph from Virginia. He was also the third. The first person to be called the President of the United States, Samuel Huntington. Why? Because the title for the President of Congress under the Articles of Confederation was President of the United States. Samuel Huntington was already serving as President of Congress when the Articles of Confederation were ratified. Some people want to get into the debate, well, who was the first one elected? Well, the first one elected is Samuel Johnston. Samuel Johnston was from North Carolina, but he was also elected to the North Carolina legislature, and he thought, hey, you know, that's a better job. You know, I don't want to be president of the United States. I'll go back to North Carolina and serve there. So he never took his office. So the next person elected was named Thomas McCune, and he is on the next page. One more. So, Maryland's only president gets the title of the first president to serve a full term in Congress, and his name is John Hansen. Now, I don't know how many buffs in here may have heard that John Hansen was black. I'm looking at this picture, he's not black. I've got a book on John Hansen. He was a Swede. He was descended from a long line of Hansens who came over in New Sweden, which I believe is in New Jersey right now. You know, he was one of about 6 or 7 brothers and sisters. And I'm highly doubtful that he was black, but a lot of people, if you Google it online, they'll find a picture of someone who also happens to be named John Hansen, and it's an old picture. But even the fact that it's a photograph should tell you it's not him. There's also a picture on the back of the $2 bill. It's a signing of the Declaration of Independence, and they say, ah, see, this guy looks darker than everyone else. And the ink does make it look darker, but if you look at the actual picture, it's not John Hansen. So, not a black guy. You know, sorry, we can't claim him. So, all right. So, the Congress declared independence, as I said, July 2nd, 1776. A lot of people want to say that the states were independent together as a group, not individually, not separately. But what's interesting is that North Carolina authorized its delegates to declare independence in March of 1776. Rhode Island declared its own independence in early May, and then Virginia declared its independence May 15th, 1776, all before July 2nd. On June 6th, I believe it is, Richard Henry Lee introduces the resolution in Congress saying that these states should be free and independent, and then the Declaration of Independence comes about. So, if the states are independent together, how could all these other states declare independence on their own? They can't. They are free and independent. They were sovereign. Immediately after doing that, the Congress says, let's draft up a constitution for the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation. The committee to draft it is listed right here, 13 people, one from each state. Actually, Thomas McKean, who I told you is the first president to be elected, or actually second elected, but he was from, I have him as Pennsylvania, but he was also from Delaware. John Dickinson from Delaware was also from Pennsylvania. They had this situation where they were serving as judges in one of the states while being elected to Congress from another state. So if you look it up and you see that they're from a place other than this listed here, then that's the explanation why. But you see many names that you may be familiar with: Samuel Adams, Josiah Bartlett, Roger Sherman. You know, he's the guy who signed everything. He was there at the Articles of Association. He was there at the Declaration of Independence, Articles of Confederation, and the 1787 Constitution. So you've got a lot of history here. And my representative, Thomas Stone, is the one from Maryland. Anybody know Thomas Nelson? I'm not familiar with him, but I think he'd be an interesting guy to study as well. Next one. Now, John Dickinson, who was the chairman of that committee, began the draft of the Articles of Confederation. It was 20 articles long when he finished it. Remember, our current Constitution is 7 articles, so it was a pretty lengthy thing. But what it did was it put all sovereign power in the hands of the Congress. And at this time, they didn't have any ideas of separating the powers out. They didn't have the idea that you know, we'd have a president who could kind of go off on his own and you know, call the troops in the war. Congress pretty much did everything. So Congress was the executive, Congress was the legislative, and Congress was the judicial. So to put all that power in the hands of Congress was very offensive to those who were called the radicals. Okay? Now this conservative author, his name is Merrill Jensen. He used radicals for those who think like us today. He used conservatives for those who wanted the more traditional values. In the third draft of his book, he said, well, I would call the radicals the new men. Okay? I would change my terminology. I guess he got a lot of flack for that. And I would call the conservatives the public leaders. Okay? It doesn't really tell me anything more. I think that defining them as radicals and conservatives really helps us refocus our ideals, because one of the things that I noticed is that we in the conservative movement tend to get sort of pigeonholed and put in a corner because the younger generation doesn't like what we're talking about. They don't like what we're talking about because they think of old people, silver hair, the old ways, slavery, all this stuff that, you know, they're taught not to like. Well, isn't it great to know that people who thought like us call themselves radicals? People like Samuel Adams are out there lighting brush fires of freedom. So if we simply want to change how people look at us, we could first come up with a name that reflects what we're really about. We're not about keeping things the same. We're actually about restoring liberty, restoring freedom, restoring religious rights. And so coming out with a bold declaration of that might just bring some of those youth to our side. But in 1776, we'll go back a little bit, Dickinson wrote his draft, but all the power in the Congress, and then they adjourned. The year went by, and in 1777, new delegates were elected. Some of the same people were still there. James Wilson was still there, but North Carolina sent a new delegate. His name was Thomas Burke. Thomas Burke, I only just discovered when I started reading about the Articles of Confederation. I've got a book here by a very liberal historian, Gordon Wood. He's on C-SPAN a lot, and he mentions Thomas Burke once in his book. But that one mention was all I needed to go and research this guy, because this is your Mel Gibson patriot right here. This is the guy. He did it all. He was governor of North Carolina. He was a delegate to Congress. He fought in the war. He got captured. He escaped. You know, unfortunately, his time in captivity caused him to come down with a health condition that caused him to die before 1787. We could have really used him in 1787, because this is the man who picked up the Dickinson draft and said, "You've got this all wrong." See, sovereignty doesn't belong in the Congress. Sovereignty belongs in the states. And so issues like who was going to pay the troops, the Congress or the states? Thomas Burke argued and succeeded in getting the states to pay the troops. Who was going to define what the state boundaries were? The Congress or the states? Thomas Burke succeeded in getting it to be the states. Who was going to punish troops if they went AWOL? Same thing. James Wilson, of course, wanted all power in the Congress. They were actually trying to get an issue over a border dispute. I think it was between Connecticut and Pennsylvania. If any of you are historians, you may know of the Yankee-Pennine War. They were trying to get Congress to weigh in on that. Well, Congress finally did, but it was like 1790 before that whole issue was settled. And people actually did die in that war. But if Congress had been able to issue a judgment beforehand, James Wilson would have been so happy, because that would mean Congress can tell the states what to do. So as of 1777, 1778, Thomas Burke was the leader of the radicals and had established that states were indeed sovereign. Get to the next one. So he is single-handedly responsible for inserting Article 2 of the Confederation. Anybody in here read the Articles of Confederation? All right, awesome. Two people. Article 2 is golden, okay? Each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this Confederation expressly delegated to the United States and Congress Assembly. Anyone heard language like that before?
After.
Declaration of Independence.
It expresses a principle that in debate James Wilson actually admitted to, that the powers not delegated are reserved. The 10th Amendment says, let me look it up real quick. Powers not delegated do to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively and to the people. Key language. Powers not delegated are reserved. I called into C-SPAN one day because there was a liberal professor on saying that, well, you know, we didn't have a president. Well, sorry, I just showed you a whole bunch of presidents under the Articles of Confederation. And that you know, the Congress can do all of these things that are not otherwise enumerated in the Constitution. I said, no, they can't. The 10th Amendment prevents them. He said, but they took out that word expressly. Because they didn't have the word expressly, that meant that you could have implied powers. Alexander Hamilton actually made this argument, that you could have implied powers and you could find, you know, new rights and new powers for Congress in the emanations and penumbras. So when we think about how things have gone downhill, think about what was lost when we got rid of Article 2 of the Confederation. Article 3, which is also important, says the said states hereby severally enter into a firm league of friendship with each other for their common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare, binding themselves to assist each other against all force offered to or attacks made upon them or any of them on account of religion, sovereignty, trade, or any pretense whatever. Now, I want to point out that the word here is league. If you go back to the definition of a federal government, it is a league. It is a league between states or nations. So they were setting up a federal government here. They call it a confederation. There's no difference if you go to 1828 and you look up the word federal, and then you flip over and you look up the word confederation, same definition, exactly word for word. So there's no difference between a federation and a confederation. We have allowed the meanings to differ. You know, now when you look up federation, it says, oh, something with a strong head at the top and composed of different states and maybe democratic in some way. That's a novel invention that they've done to cause us to think differently about what federal is. Federal is a league between states or nations. Another thing I'll point out is when they talk about the things that they will come to each other's defense on, the first thing they list is religion. Religion. When we rewrote our Constitution for 1787, you have freedom of religion, but freedom of religion, as you know, has been twisted all out of context so that people can say, oh, well, the only religion you can practice is atheism, you know, and otherwise, you know, you can't have any Ten Commandments statues, you can't have any pictures of Jesus anywhere. Unfortunately, you know, the left can't read because that First Amendment says Congress shall make no law. Congress being that first part. But the other place it mentions religion is in the part outlawing religious tests to serve in office. And I'm sure your Virginia Constitution follows suit. My state of Maryland has actually a religious requirement. You have to believe in an afterlife and consequences for your actions in this world in order to serve on a jury. But then they amended it to say right after that, but none of this shall be construed to be an establishment of religion. None of this shall be construed to be a religious test. So that destruction of the meaning, of the original meaning, is carried over into the 1787 Constitution. So I want to do a brief history of Rome because I believe that those who founded our government in 1776 and on were actually trying to model the government after Rome. Most of them had studied Rome. They knew Roman history. They also knew the history of, you know, ancient Greece and Europe. But some of these names will come back in a few minutes. The Roman Republic was founded in 509 BC. There's a lot of legend and lore that precedes it, but it ended up being a monarchy. Came about right about the same time as the Athenian democracies. And and the Roman people decided that they wanted no more kings. So the Tarquinian dynasty, which was the last line of kings, stepped down, and a senate was elected from the patricians being the landowning class, and the plebeians being, the lower class who weren't qualified. You had to be a patrician in order to be eligible for the senate. And from the senate they selected their consuls. The name changed over the years, but it's best to just refer to them as consuls throughout. So consuls were kind of like what we think of as a president today, but really they were more like a general. They had supreme powers, but they really weren't in charge. It was the Senate, that symbol SPQR, the Senate and People of Rome. The Senate was seen to be the sovereign power. But during times of military emergency, the consul could be declared dictator. And as dictator, everything he said went. Lucius Junius Brutus was one of the first two consuls, and the other one was Collatinus Tarquinius. Collatinus Tarquinius, descended from the line of kings that had preceded, was always distrusted by the people. They thought he was going to make himself king, even though he wasn't really doing anything to make himself king. They basically forced him to step down. When he stepped down, the people elected, or the Senate elected, Publius Valerius. And so you see these two gentlemen up top. They both have beards, so I like that. Publius Valerius and Lucius Junius Brutus were your first two Roman consuls. Many came after them. I don't have enough time to tell you about all of the significant ones. There's a lot of Roman history, a good 500 years there. But one that I'll mention is Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus became consul, was a successful general, led Rome to many victories, and then could have made himself dictator for life, but stepped down, retired, went back into private life. When George Washington had won the war and came back and surrendered his sword to Congress in Annapolis, he was called America's Cincinnatus. He could have made himself a king. Everyone was really willing to follow him in everything he did, but he retired, went back to private life until they made him president a few years later. Other people to note are Cicero and Cato Uticensis. It's Cato the Younger. Cato the Elder had lived during the Punic Wars. I'll mention him in a minute, but Cicero and Cato Uticensis were the chief critics of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was a very ambitious young politician. The consul preceding him, named Sulla, was a very successful general, but he had put a lot of hurdles in the way so that it would be very difficult for someone to rise to power and then make themselves dictator for life. But if anyone could do it, it was Caesar. And when Caesar got together with the triumvirate, it was made that much more possible. But Caesar had a very, very colorful life, to put it mildly. His carryings on with Cleopatra and so forth are legendary. And Cato and Cicero were there to build their careers, actually, on trying to prevent Caesar from coming to power. As you know, eventually Caesar became dictator, became consul, and then he made himself dictator. And then he didn't step down. Now, one thing I failed to mention was that when Brutus was consul, he passed a law saying that if anyone doesn't step down as dictator, we don't want any kings, any Roman has the right to kill that person. Okay? Publius outlived Brutus. Brutus died in a war. And Publius was actually thought to be setting himself up to be king as well. He built his house upon a hill, his castle. He started having parades or tributes for himself, and the people were very distrusting of him. And so he passed an oath, that the Roman people should never again select a king. And that was enough to please them. So obviously he was a very good politician. But when Caesar made himself dictator, or was made dictator, and then refused to step down, the Senate became concern. And that is when they conspired for the events on the Ides of March. And on the Ides of March, he went into the Senate, and they pulled out their knives, and they put an end to his reign. Initially, before there was a civil war that came afterwards, but initially there was no one put to death. Why? Because Brutus's law said anyone who refuses to step down as dictator can be put to death. I guess I will note, in case anyone's wondering, there's another Brutus, Marcus Brutus. Marcus Brutus was one of the senators, and in the play by Julius Caesar, he says "et tu, Brute," but he is not the same Brutus. He's a distant relative. And there was another one that I was reading about yesterday, Decimus Brutus Albina, okay, who was also key in Caesar's assassination. Those names carry over into the 1787 convention, when Madison, Hamilton, and Jay want to sell the American people the idea of this new constitution, this new form of government. They all write as Publius. There were different Anti-Federalists who were opposing them. Some of them wrote as Cato, wrote as Publicola, but the most prolific one wrote as Brutus. And I'll get to that in a minute. I want to tell you about Article 13 of the Articles of Confederation now. And unfortunately it's not in your slides, but I have it right here. Because remember that the Articles of Confederation were the Constitution for the United States. And Article 13 says, every state shall abide by the determination of the United States and Congress assembled on all questions which by this Confederation are submitted to them. And the Articles of Confederation shall be invariably observed by every state, and the Union shall be perpetual. Nor shall any alteration at any time hereafter be made in any of them, unless such alteration be agreed to in a Congress of the United States, and be afterwards confirmed by the legislature of every state.
What you were just reading.
Key words to point out. Congress, not the Philadelphia Convention. The Philadelphia Convention was not a Congress. The legislatures of every state, not state ratifying conventions. So when we look at the fact that that's how they went about creating a new constitution, they didn't do it in accordance with the existing constitution. There was a process there. It was already established. They had a means of doing it, and they refused to use that means. When we talk about how our government should follow the Constitution today, well, imagine what would have happened if they had followed the Constitution back then. Now, the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, was very difficult to amend. All 13 states had to agree. They met in a convention in 1786 to propose amendments. But only 5 states showed up, or at least got there on time before they canceled the meeting. Other delegates were en route, but they said, no, let's meet next year. But when they convened again in 1787, Rhode Island smelled a rat. So did Patrick Henry, and refused to send delegates. Rhode Island is a very interesting state in this whole process. Anyone heard of the impost of 1781? Good thing you haven't, because it didn't come to pass. You see, Rhode Island and many others had said, well, that's unconstitutional. There's no power in the Articles of Confederation for you to impose an impost on every state. Every state agreed to it except Rhode Island. Robert Morris, who's considered the financier of the Revolution and was basically our first Secretary of Treasury under the Articles of Confederation. They called him the Minister of Finance. He controlled everything. He is the mastermind behind bankrolling and financing the American government. Interestingly enough, he ended up poor. But a lot of people give him credit for making the revolution possible. It's not necessarily the case, and you consider that we had loans coming in from overseas. But Robert Morris went to the governor of Rhode Island, and he said, you know, you say it's unconstitutional, but if all the states agree to it, it becomes constitutional. Hey, come on. Thankfully, the governor of Rhode Island said no. We saw the rules change. Not so that all 13 states had to agree, but only 9 states had to agree. People are talking about an Article 5 convention. And Article 5 talks about how you get into a convention. It doesn't talk about what happens once the convention started. Once the convention has begun, the convention can make its own rules, just like they did in 1787. I was talking to Rita Dunaway, Michael Ferris's right-hand woman, and she said the states met in their sovereign capacities. I said, well, that's great. Why don't we meet in our sovereign capacities today, and then we can redo this whole thing. But as such, they even went further. They said, we're not acting as the states, we're acting as the people, and the people is a higher power than the states, which was offensive to me because, remember, the article said the states were sovereign. The people are sovereign over their states. They're not sovereign over a national government because we didn't form a national government. Well, that's what they were trying to do in 1787, was switch our government from a federal government to a national government. When they went and they changed how everything was to work, there was a lot of protest from the Anti-Federalists. But many states, including my own of Maryland, approved the Constitution without any amendments. Maryland approved the Constitution with no amendments whatsoever. At least some had the decency to demand amendments. Now, even so, we know the Constitution goes into effect in 1789. Bill of Rights isn't ratified until 1791. You're living all that time on a promise. We're going to amend it, and we're going to give protections to the people. And most of the Bill of Rights is just designed to protect the people, except for the 10th Amendment. So these are things to think about before you go and commit yourselves to another convention. They could run roughshod over you just like they did in 1787. So, I talked about the Anti-Federalists, and these are the ones that I think are most important to know. Unfortunately, Thomas Burke, again, didn't live long enough, so he's not on this list. But Robert Yates is a New York judge, and he wrote very voluminously and intelligently, almost like he was a fortune teller. Pretty much everything he warned of has come to pass, whether it's the General Welfare Clause or the Necessary and Proper Clause, or Congress just ignoring the will of the people and aggregating power to itself. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture of him. If you Google his name, you will get a picture of the other New York delegate, John Lansing. Okay, but don't be fooled. It's just all we've got is his signature. Luther Martin, Maryland's first Attorney General. He is also the longest-serving Attorney General in Maryland. He defended Samuel Chase in his impeachment trial. And when you think of the, what's the case with the National Bank? Well, it'll come to me in a minute. But he is the lawyer who argued that seminal case wherein John Marshall came in on the other side and said the power to tax is the power to destroy. Okay? McCulloch v. Maryland, that's what it is. McCulloch v. Maryland, Maryland had actually levied a tax against the National Bank, trying to destroy it. We were able to destroy the first national bank, Andrew Jackson destroyed the second national bank, and now we got the Federal Reserve. It's like these national banks keep coming back. Luther Martin was our champion trying to destroy it then, and his arguments are very state sovereignty oriented. So if you get a chance to read that, it's very good reading. Many of you know about the Lee brothers. Richard Henry Lee and his other three brothers were the chief antagonists against Robert Morris in the Congress. Richard Henry Lee wrote as the Federal Farmer. He wrote a lot of articles, and they're very insightful. Unfortunately, most of them are repetitive. So there's only really about 7 of them that are must reads. And then of course Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry, if you go online, is considered to be the leader of the Anti-Federalists. He certainly was a leader at the Virginia Ratifying Convention, and he's a very powerful speaker. So I'll give you a taste of what some of these Anti-Federalists said. Luther Martin had taken offense to the fact that when they got to Philadelphia, they made them all swear an oath not to tell anything back to their states, not to report anything back about what was going on. It was all done in secrecy because they didn't want anyone coming in and interfering with the proceedings. He burst out. He left. He was one of the first to leave. Eventually, Robert Gates left. Most of the Anti-Federalists left. But Luther Martin went back to Maryland and said, "Hey, I'm going to tell you what's going on there." And they said, we'll let you testify in November." The Constitution is signed in September, so it's already, written in stone. They don't let him testify until November. His testimony is something called the Genuine Information. It's very large, about 40 pages of reading, but it goes through all of the weaknesses that we don't even think about. We read the Constitution and we think, oh, this is preserving our rights. There are many points in it where if you look at it from a legal vantage point, you realize our rights aren't protected at all. But one of his big bones to pick, which you won't find among a lot of the other Anti-Federalists, is he was adamant about preserving religion. The part of this system which provides that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States was adopted by a great majority of the convention and without much debate. However, there were some members so unfashionable as to think that a belief of the existence of a deity and of a state of future rewards and punishments would be some security for the good conduct of our rulers, and that in a Christian country it would be at least decent to hold out some distinction between the professors of Christianity and downright infidelity or paganism. Today we have a president who says, regardless of what we once were, America is no longer a Christian nation. It's crazy. Luther Martin also said, and this is his conclusion, or very near his conclusion, "I oppose the system there with the same explicit frankness with which I have here given you a history of our proceedings, and an account of my own conduct, which in a particular manner I consider you as having a right to know. While there I endeavored to act as became a free man, and the delegate of a free state. Should my conduct obtain the approbation of those who appointed me, I will not deny it would afford me satisfaction. But to me that approbation was at most no more than a secondary consideration. My first was to deserve it. Left to myself to act according to the best of my discretion, my conduct should have been the same. Had I been even sure your censure would have been my only reward, since I hold it sacredly my duty to dash the cup of poison, if possible, from the hand of a state or an individual, however anxious the one or the other might be to swallow it." Patrick Henry, at the Virginia Ratifying Convention, spoke of the dangers he saw. "Here is a revolution as radical as that which separated us from Great Britain. It is as radical if, in this transition, our rights and privileges are endangered and the sovereignty of the states be relinquished. And cannot we plainly see that this is actually the case? The rights of conscience, trial by jury, liberty of the press," remember they didn't have a Bill of Rights, and he was arguing for a Bill of Rights, "all your immunities and franchises, all pretensions to human rights and privileges are rendered insecure, if not lost, by this change so loudly talked of by some and inconsiderately by others. Is this same relinquishment of rights worthy of freemen? Is it worthy of that manly fortitude that ought to characterize Republicans? It is said 8 states have adopted this plan." Remember that 9 were needed. "I declare that if 12 states and a half had adopted it, I would with manly firmness and in spite of an erring world reject it. You are not to inquire how your trade may be increased, nor how you are to become a great and powerful people, but how your liberties can be secured, for liberty ought to be the direct end of your government. Okay. One more from Patrick Henry. And this is him going back and forth with an argument that I think Madison was making. And Madison was saying, well, you know, we're giving you a federal government. Patrick Henry said, no, it's not federal. It's a national government. And national was being kind. You know, they were really creating a consolidated empire. Okay, but they use the word national because you get into debating and people won't let you speak. So Madison, if you read the Federalist Papers, says, oh, but we have a combined government. It's partly federal, it's partly national, and we get a better government that way. Remember that the Articles of Confederation made it clear, a league of nations, or states. We are told that this government collectively taken is without an example, that it is national in this part and federal in that part, etc. We may be amused if we please by a treatise of political anatomy. In the brain, it is national. The stamina are federal. I think that means the lungs. Some limbs are federal, others national. The senators are voted for by the state legislatures. So far, it is federal. That's been done away with by the 17th Amendment. Individuals choose the members of the first branch. Here, it is national. It is federal in conferring general powers, but national in retaining them. It is not to be supported by the states. The pockets of individuals are to be searched for its maintenance. Now we got the 16th Amendment and the income tax, it's not that much worse. What signifies it to me that you have the most curious anatomical description of it in its creation? To all common purposes of legislation, it is a great consolidation of government. You are not to have a right to legislate in any but trivial cases. You are not to touch private contracts. You are not to have the right of having arms in your own defense. You cannot be trusted with dealing out justice between man and man. What shall the states have to do? Take care of the poor, repair and make highways, erect bridges, and so on and so forth. Federal government, national government does all that right now. Abolish the state legislatures at once. What purpose should they be continued for? Our legislature will indeed be a ludicrous spectacle. 180 men marching in solemn farcical procession, exhibiting a mournful proof of the lost liberty of their country, without the power of restoring it. Remember, Virginia is a country to them. But, sir, we have the consolidation, or the consolation, that it is a mixed government. That is, it may work sorely on your neck, but you will have some comfort by saying that it was a federal government in its origin. It's Patrick Henry, Virginia. There were 3 Anti-Federalists who stayed behind, and it's good that they did, because even though their names don't appear on the Constitution, when people write about it, when people talk about it, when people paint paintings of it, I've been to Hillsdale College, their branch in D.C., and they've got a painting of the signing of the Constitution, and these gentlemen are standing off to the side. And so our history now knows there wasn't unanimity. Like they tell us there was unanimity at the Declaration of Independence, there wasn't. But we know that these 3 were not going along. We also know that Luther Martin, Robert Yates, all these others left the convention. And I want to point out that not only does Rhode Island not have any signatures on the Constitution, but if you look under New York's signatures, all of their delegates left, except Alexander Hamilton. So George Mason of Virginia, Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, and Edmund Randolph of Virginia. Edmund Randolph actually introduced the Virginia plan. But that doesn't mean that he wanted it, and he made it clear. He was sort of on the fence a lot of the ways, and he eventually ended up joining the national government, so did Elbridge Gerry. You know, when I consider it to be a true anti-federalist is someone who says, you know what, I will not participate in this national monstrosity. So gentlemen like George Mason, Patrick Henry, so forth, did not go on to serve. Luther Martin definitely did not go on to serve in the national government. It's interesting that Mark Levin and Michael Ferris will point to George Mason and say that, you know, oh, he supported, you know, Article 5. You know, well, That doesn't mean he supported all of the abuses that have come since then. Okay, it doesn't mean that he supported the lack of state sovereignty. George Mason also said he wanted 3 presidents, 3 confederacies with a president for each. That didn't happen. So just because he supports an idea in debate doesn't mean that, you know, the whole plan is good. Interestingly enough, Luther Martin proposed the Supremacy Clause. The one that says that you know, all the judges and everyone in the states has to adhere to the rulings of the national government. Well,
Constitution.
Constitution.
Yeah.
what did I say?
The
National
national
government.
Right. So, but the interesting thing is that Luther Martin, although he submitted the Supremacy Clause, did not approve of its final form. And so just saying that someone supported the idea in its origin doesn't mean that they support the way it is and the way it's being applied right now. A quote from Brutus, because gentlemen like Alexander Hamilton were arguing that, again, we didn't need a Bill of Rights. He said we didn't need a Bill of Rights because the Constitution was itself a Bill of Rights. If we tried to enumerate all your rights, we'd leave some out, and the powers not delegated are reserved. So we don't need to talk about what rights you have, because anything that we don't specify otherwise, you retain. Well, Brutus says, this is Robert Yates, we find that they have in the 9th section of the first article, we would say Article 1, Section 9 now, declared that the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless in cases of rebellion, that no bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed, that no title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, etc. If everything which is not given is reserved, what propriety is there in these exceptions? Does this Constitution anywhere grant the power of suspending habeas corpus, or to make ex post facto laws, pass bills of attainder, or grant titles of nobility? It certainly does not in express terms. In other words, you know, and there's a whole Federalist paper dedicated to arguing against the principle of the Bill of Rights, because Alexander Hamilton says, hey, you know, any powers that we've not delegated are reserved. Well, why is Article 1, Section 9 sitting there telling the federal government what powers it doesn't have? It totally violates that principle. So he disproves Alexander Hamilton right here. In Maryland, there was a significant debate, and I wanted to bring this out because the gentleman, John Francis Mercer, originally wrote as a farmer, and he was going back and forth in a lot of articles with a man named Aristides. Aristides, upon further research, is Alexander Conti Hansen. If you look up Aristides, or if you look up Alexander Hansen, it's very difficult to find a picture of him. I found this one recently, but you'll probably find this guy in the middle because he actually served in office. Alexander Hansen is John Hansen's son. Remember that first president to serve a full term? Their side of the family, their whole family, was on the side of the big government Federalists. And so he gets into many debates. He gets in debates with Samuel Chase. He gets in debates through the newspaper under the pen name of Aristides over whether or not we should have a Bill of Rights. And I brought out this quote because it jumped out at me. They cannot enact a Bill of Rights because they were acting as, this is Aristides, as private individuals, any of whom have a right to propose a constitution to the Americans to adopt at their discretion. Now, you know, I always came from the vantage point, oh, we need Congress to do it for us. You know, we gotta go through this amendment process and, you know, just add it piecemeal. But if Aristides is telling us that any American citizen can write a constitution and submit it to be adopted at our discretion, then why are we trying to just peck around the edges? Why are we trying to add 50 judges or implement, you know, a flat tax that is still an unconstitutional tax, right? So I said, well, let's write a constitution that does exactly what we want and do it the right way. But has this been done before? Well, yes, it has. Because in 1787, they introduced Virginia Plan, New Jersey Plan, and Alexander Hamilton had his own plan. Those were not Congress's plans. Those were not, things that have been approved by some committee. They drew those up on their own. They, as I see it, stacked the convention because they weren't able to get approval through the state legislatures. They weren't able to get approval through Congress. And so they stacked the convention. They brought their own constitutions. They took what they liked. They left out what they didn't like. And then that's how we got the Constitution we have now. Other noteworthy Anti-Federalists. George Clinton of New York. Remember that most of New York's delegation, all but one, left the convention. George Clinton is a leading Anti-Federalist. He's believed to have written a Sentinel. A lot of these names are what historians have concluded by comparing the works under their names to the writings, or in some cases, like in the cases of Madison and Hamilton, they've claimed some of the articles. Rowlands Lowndes of South Carolina, and the only woman Anti-Federalist I know of, Mercy Otis Warren, who wrote as a Columbian Patriot. And I've got a quote from her here. It is an undisputed fact that not one legislature in the United States had the most distant idea when they first appointed members for a convention entirely commercial, or when they afterwards authorized them to consider on some amendments of the federal union, that they would, without any warrant from their constituents, presume on so bold and daring a stride as ultimately to destroy the state governments, and offer a consolidated system, irreversible, but on conditions that the smallest degree of penetration must discover to be impracticable. So here we have, and what's interesting about Mercy Warren is that she is also the first woman to write a history of the American Revolution. So she was there at the time, and she is observing that the states had no idea that they were trying to destroy their system of government, to destroy that federal government. She also points out how much of an injustice it was, what they did to, Luther Martin pointed out how they made them swear oaths and not report back. And she goes line by line through the Constitution as well and talks about all of the usurpations of liberty that exist in it. Unfortunately, if anyone's tried to read the Federalist Papers, especially when Alexander Hamilton is writing, it's very difficult to read because they use very flowery language, sometimes unnecessarily. This is the most coherent line I could find from Mercy Warren, because everything else, I'm in the dictionary every second looking up what she's actually saying. So very intelligent, very bright woman. I think she's the wife of James Warren, no, daughter of James Otis, and her husband, Mr. Warren, can't remember his first name, was also a very significant patriot. And they went back and forth with John Adams several times during the American Revolution. Next one. Two more quotes from Brutus. And I just want to convey this to you. Actually, I have this as Brutus, but I think he wrote this as Sidney. But these letters of Sidney, Brutus is very formal and very, before the fact. Sidney comes after the Constitution is signed. And so he writes that although government reported by the convention does not go to a perfect and entire consolidation, yet it approaches so near to it that it must, if executed, certainly and infallibly terminate in it. Mercy Warren said something very similar. It appears from these articles that there is no need of any intervention of the state governments between the Congress and the people to execute any one power vested in the general government, and that the constitutions and laws of every state are nullified and declared void, so far as they are or shall be inconsistent with this Constitution, or the laws made in pursuance of it, or with treaties made under the authority of the United States. It's going to the Supremacy Clause. He's saying they're destroying the sovereignty of the states. The government then, so far as it extends, is a complete one. Because they were saying, oh, don't worry about it, we're not going to touch like everything that the states do. He says it's a complete one, and not a confederation. It is much one complete government as that of New York or Massachusetts, has its absolute and perfect powers to make and execute all laws, to appoint officers, institute courts, declare offenses, and annex penalties with respect to every object to which it extends as any other in the world. So far, therefore, as its powers reach, all ideas of confederation are given up and lost. It is true this government is limited to certain objects, or to speak more properly, some small degree of power is still left to the states, but a little attention to the powers vested in the general government will convince every candid man that if it is capable of being executed, all that is reserved for the individual states must very soon be annihilated, except so far as they are barely necessary to the organization of the general government. The powers of the legislature extend to every case that is of the least importance. There is nothing valuable to human nature, nothing dear to free men, but what is within their power. It has the authority to make laws which will affect the lives, the liberty, and property of every man in the United States. Nor can the Constitution or laws of any state in any way prevent or impede the full and complete execution of every power given. And I titled this, Brutus Predicts Obamacare. When John Roberts came in and said, hey, the individual mandate is a tax, well, that meant that the national government now has the power to come in and command you to engage in purchasing a product against your will.
When they never should have had the power to tax.
Next slide.
On that last slide, didn't he say that in defense of the Bill of Rights? Was it before? Didn't he say that before the Bill of Rights, and that wasn't after the Bill of Rights? That he changed his mind, or is that?
I don't think that the Bill of Rights changed that one bit. Okay, Congress still has the power to touch everything, and the argument that he is making is, I think, against someone like Madison saying, you know, this isn't really going to annihilate the states. The states, you know, my state constitution begins that we have the police power. We have the power to regulate our internal police. We have the power to build roads and bridges. We have the power to, you know, if we want to, you know, do education and all these other things that the national government doesn't have power to do. They do it anyway. What he's saying is, they have power to do it all. Okay? He's saying you don't see it, but all you have to do is read between the lines. And as I see it, the Bill of Rights didn't get rid of that one bit. If you read the 10th Amendment as I initially did, you could argue that the 10th Amendment prevents the national government from doing that. But again, the lack of the word expressly, the lack of the word sovereign, free, and independent means that the supreme government, the sovereign government, can come in and tell the states what to do. And now you're in a debate. Now you're trying to see, can I get enough judges to agree with me, or can they get enough judges to agree with them? Because you didn't say it explicitly in the Constitution. So, June 1788, Sidney writes, from this contrast it appears that the general government, when completely organized, will absorb all those powers of the state which the framers of its Constitution had declared should be only exercised by the representatives of the people of the state. That the burdens and expense of supporting a state establishment will be perpetuated, but its operations to ensure or contribute to any essential measures promotive of the happiness of the people may be totally prostrated. The general government arrogating to itself the right of interfering in the most minute objects of internal police and the most trifling domestic concerns of every state, by possessing a power of passing laws to provide for the general welfare of the United States, which may affect life, liberty, and property in every modification they may think expedient, unchecked by cautionary reservations and unrestrained by a declaration of any of those rights which the wisdom and prudence of America in the year 1776 held ought to be at all events protected from violation. In a word, the new Constitution will prove finally to dissolve all the power of the several state legislatures and destroy the rights and liberties of the people. For the power of the first will be all in all, and of the latter a mere shadow and form without substance. And if adopted, we may, in imitation of the Carthaginians, say, Delende vit America. Anybody know what that's from? Delende vit America. I mentioned before when we were talking about Rome that Cato, the elder, had lived during the Punic Wars when Rome was at war with Carthage. And because he felt it was critical to defeat Carthage, he would end every speech. Didn't matter what the subject was. It could be about plumbing and aqueducts and all that kind of stuff. And he would say, Carthago delende est. Okay, so he's got his Latin a little bit wrong, but the whole idea is to refer back to that. He's saying that because this is so destructive to America, that we may as well be saying America is going to be destroyed. Okay, and eventually Rome did destroy Carthage, but it was a heavy battle. So, as I think about what we can do to restore our government, I look at how politics play out today. This is a map of the counties, and I don't know if you can see it on your slides, it may be too small, but if you Google Colin Woodward, there's a few articles out there, there's even a book by him that covers this. He talks about how there's 11 ideological Americans. And what I'm interested in is, trying to redefine how we look at the word state. Because when we go back to the dictionary definition, they talk about a state or a nation being about people with common interests, common language, common family, things like that. Okay? But the states we live in today, there's no commonality. It's just what, King Charles or whoever the king was at the time drew, before the colonists came over here and settled those areas. And then whatever was done by the national government out of the Midwest afterwards when they were dividing up the Northwest Territory. But why should we live in states where we don't share common values with everyone else? Why should people in Vermont who want socialist health care and same-sex marriage have a say in what happens in Georgia or what happens in Alabama or Mississippi? But they do. Well, that's not how Republican government should work. That's not representative government. So this should give you some thoughts about how we could redo it if we had a chance. And there's another article that goes with this that talks about dividing up, the continental U.S. by population, dividing it up, in even squares, things like that. But this one I found the most interesting and valuable because I believe we should define a state as people with the same values, the same interests, who want to be governed by the same laws. You don't want a law taxing your income? That shouldn't be the law. If you want a law that taxes your income, hey, have fun. Make that your government and make that your law. And so you see at this map, they've divided the country. They kind of go back to the historical and linguistic roots. And so those areas that speak Spanish are El Norte. The areas that speak French are New France. You've got your deep south, you've got your greater Appalachia, you've got the far west, you've got the left coast. And he's saying how if you look, and again this is done by counties, but if you look at these areas, they tend to share the same values, so maybe they should be in their own state. Now I just read the other day that Jefferson wants to separate out from California, so a couple of those counties may have to be removed from the left coast, but over here we're in Tidewater, and fortunately it comes right below DC. We may have to leave out Arlington and Alexandria too,
Yes.
but we could think about making a new state of Tidewater and bring in the conservative parts of Maryland, the conservative parts of Virginia, maybe if North Carolina wants to go in too, and have our own country, our own state, with a government that actually reflects our values.
When was this map created?
This was I found it last year. It was in an article. If you look up "Get Me Rewrite," I think it's the New American or something like that. It's a sub article in that, but it's another. Like I said, there's a book, and there's a couple other articles that go along with it. So if you look up Colin Woodward, you'll find all this stuff on it. So it's not like today, but it's within the past 5 years.
Okay, and
Okay, so 2 more slides. All right, so what the Anti-Federalists were for. Herbert J. Storing, who wrote the complete Anti-Federalist, this is not the complete Anti-Federalist, this is an abridged version. The first volume of his book is called What the Anti-Federalists Were For. And it's very important to look at it this way because it's tempting to say, hey, we've got our Constitution now and it's awesome, and those Anti-Federalists, they were just against the Constitution. Well, what were they for? They were patriots. They believed in the country that they had fought for, bled for, died for, the country that they were born into, and that we shouldn't undo it. Okay? They believed in federalism. That was the government alluded to by the Declaration of Independence and established in the original Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. So they were being loyal to their Constitution. And that's why I call Madison and Hamilton and Jay the usurpers. They believed in a small republic. There are many comments in debate. As I said, George Mason said 13 states is too big. We need to divide it up into 3 separate confederacies. They were for militias rather than standing armies. Just about every state constitution has something to the effect that says the standing armies are dangerous to liberty. What did they give us? A standing army. You know, who would dare go against this government with that standing army they had? Liberty over union. Patrick Henry, at the Virginia Ratifying Convention, was being accused of wanting to make himself president of his own confederation. He didn't back away from that, but he did try to play politics, and he tried to say both. But he valued liberty over union. Were all the states more terrible than the mother country to join against us? I hope Virginia could defend herself, but sir, the dissolution of the Union is most abhorrent to my mind. The first thing I have in my heart is American liberty. The second thing is American union. Liberty comes first. They were for a weak executive. Okay? I don't know if I said it before, but every member of Congress was elected for a 1-year term. This language comes up again and again and again as you read all the suggestions for amendments. Rhode Island's suggestions for amendments. Interestingly enough, last to come in, of the original 13, most of their suggestions were completely ignored. But one of the things was they want a frequent rotation in office. And when they said frequent, they mean yearly. You know, everybody knows that Patrick Henry is your first governor. Thomas Jefferson was the governor of Virginia. George Mason's the governor of Virginia. How do you get all these governors of Virginia in such a short period of time? They have term limits? Yes. 1-year terms. 1-year terms. Why do they need to be in there for 4 or 8 years like they are? So the president of Congress was elected. The president was elected from Congress, and he served a 1-year term, and then he went back to Congress afterwards. A member of Congress could only be elected three years in a row, and then after that they had to be out for 3 years. So there's your term limits right there. Restraints on taxes. Article 8 of the Articles of Confederation talks about the taxing system. They did it by requisitions. Land and property value only. Okay? It's interesting that, you know, progressives don't want it because then you're only taxing the rich. If you don't own land, you're not paying taxes. Jury trials. Just about every state is demanding jury trials in the Bill of Rights. Well, we actually did achieve that, but if you look at Article 3, there's no jury for the Supreme Court. There's no jury required for the courts created by Congress. That's a great flaw. Religion and rights of conscience. This keeps coming back. The right of conscience shall be held inviolable, and neither the legislative nor judicial powers of the United States shall have authority to alter, abrogate, or infringe any part of the Constitution of the several states which provide for the preservation of liberty in matters of religion. This was the religious liberty amendment suggested by the Pennsylvania minority. They obviously did not get it added to the Constitution. But when you look at what's happening with our religious rights today, how much better it would be if that had gotten added in. And something that's not celebrated but needs to be celebrated more is they were for the abolition of slavery. I'm not sure if I have it on the sheets that you have there, but I wanted to include that because most, if not all, of the Anti-Federalists were against the system of slavery in some way. They pointed out, and Luther Martin was the biggest voice on this, pointed out how the Constitution we have now preserved the system of slavery. Now running as a Republican, I had to go and defend Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings and all this, all these years. But the fact is, there was a group of people arguing against it in 1787. They said we didn't want slavery in our system. Slavery doesn't even occur in the Articles of Confederation. The word is not there. Now, it was a state sovereignty issue, so you had, southern states that had slavery, but northern states, some northern states had outlawed it. New York still had slavery. Alexander Hamilton had purchased slaves. But the thing was, in 1780, Massachusetts creates its revolutionary constitution, puts liberty to all men in the Constitution, and says, hey, this means we can't have slaves. Boom, slavery ends in Massachusetts. Now the interesting thing is, instead of saying, well, this means that the Massachusetts is a sovereign state, and if a slave escapes to Massachusetts, he's now free, in the 1787 Constitution, they write in, if a slave escapes to your state, you have to send him back. As a matter of fact, your governor has to help to send him back. These kinds of things, plus the 20-year moratorium on ending the slave trade, are things that the Anti-Federalists complained against and said, these are weaknesses in the Constitution, you need to get rid of them. Even Rawlins Lowndes of South Carolina, who was a slave owner and was pro-slavery, said, this is dangerous because you are bringing in people who are always going to be hostile to your country. They're always going to be a threat to your system of government. Don't do it. So, if Rawlins Lowndes can say, get rid of the slavery system, then why didn't we do it? And so these are things that make me say, don't call me a Democrat, don't call me a Republican, call me an Anti-Federalist. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any questions?
Wasn't the fugitive slave